Symposium at the World Congress of Middle East Studies here in Seville, Spain. Today, Thursday, July 19th, for the people online who are joining us and for the people who will be joining us later on. My name is Rabab Ibrahim Abdulhadi. I'm the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas Studies and associate professor of race and resistance studies and ethnic studies at San Francisco State University. I'm going to introduce the way you have the programs. If people don't have the programs, see.
The technician is here.
Okay. Can I speak while he's fixing it?
Sure.
All right, maybe not.
Is that better?
The first begin. Yeah.
Okay.
Does it disappear? Oh,
Is it better?
can we get? Can we make it?
Can we make it bigger while keeping it centered?
Okay.
The problem
No.
is we have to move it from.
Oh, okay.
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 All right. Okay. Good morning again, and welcome to the Teaching Palestine Pedagogical Praxis and the Indivisibility of Justice Symposium. You have the program today. The program begins now, and it will end at 7 in the evening for today, for the World Congress of Middle East Studies. What we will do, and I'm going to explain this a little bit, we have, on each panel we have a number. The chair is going to be an active chair, basically introduce the topic because we have different people coming in, and also summarize after the presenters. The presenters will speak, comment on each other. Each person has 10 to 15 minutes, and if people go a few couple of minutes, it's not really a problem. But we want to have plenty of time for discussion, but we also want to have enough time for engagement of the participants in the symposium who are going to be continuing this project further. So I'm going to actually start by introducing the concept, the topic itself, and I'm also one of the presenters on this panel. So if I go over my time, I'm going to actually take from the time that I have later on, so, because it's double duty. Okay. So initiated by the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies and co-sponsored by Al-Najah National University in Naples, Palestine, Birzeit University in Birzeit, Palestine, and the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg, South Africa, this international symposium on teaching Palestine, pedagogical praxis, and the indivisibility of justice is part of Ahmed Studies' multi-site and multi-year project. It builds on the fall 2016, spring 2017 Conversations on Palestine, Colonialism, Racism, and Justice, which was held in collaboration with the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. It also builds on the spring 2017 teach-in on the 50th anniversary of the 67 occupation of Palestinian and other Arab lands, Israeli occupation of Palestinian and other lands, the 10th anniversary of the blockade of Gaza, and the 18th anniversary of the liberation of South Lebanon. It also builds on the anniversaries of the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration on November 2017, and the 70th anniversary of the UN partition in Palestine, as well as thematic conversations at the Middle East Studies Association in November 2017. It also builds two international conferences we organized at Birzeit University and with Birzeit University, at An-Najah National University and with An-Najah National University in March 2016. This project also marked the 70th anniversary of the Deir Yassin massacre at San Francisco State in April 2018, the 70th anniversary of Nakba at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and Al-Auda National Convention in LA in May 2018, coinciding actually with the Great March of Britain in Gaza. The Caribbean Studies Association, which was held in Havana, Cuba in June 2018. And future plans include Never Repeat History, a project that is in collaboration with the Japanese American community in San Francisco Bay Area in August, in a couple of weeks. In South Africa in October, on focusing on alternative education at multiple universities and communities. At McGill University, marking the 36th anniversary of the Sabra and Shatila massacre and the narrations of women and war. And we're also going to be at the American Studies Association and the National Women's Studies Association, focusing on the 50th anniversary of the Global 68. And in France in March 2019, and we will be most likely having a second round of conferences in Palestine sometime in March or April of 2019. In short, this is a very long-term project that one conference and one site does not cover everything. The current political and historical moment is particularly significant. Israeli colonialism, racism, and occupation is deepening and entrenching. Today, actually, the New York Times has a big article on the settlements on the West Bank that I haven't had a chance to continue reading it, but it actually basically says that Palestinians make up 88% of the population in the West Bank and gain almost none of the territory. And it's written by Isabel Kirshner, so we'll see. By contrast, Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project is appropriately taking multiple and different forms in all of the geographies of disposition, displacement, and precarious existence, as we've seen in several panels around this conference. Shaping Palestinian politics is a regional and international context that is characterized by deepening poverty, civil wars, imperial and international context, interventions, unrestrained neopolitical economic policies, hostile alliances, and recolonization of previously decolonized nations. Rooted in xenophobia, Orientalist, Zionist, and other supremacist ideologies, the consolidation of the global and regional alliances under the guise of the so-called war on terror has fueled an alarming rise in Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, as well as the violent escalations targeting marginalized communities, as Rashid Khalidi articulated in his speech last night, in his acceptance speech of the award last night. These political, social, economic, and socio-cultural dynamics shape the learning environment within and outside the classroom and extend beyond campus grounds. The rise of the neoliberal corporate university has shrunk the emancipatory spaces expanded by the radical movements of the 1960s and 70s in both the global south and north, including anti-colonial national liberation movements. Epistemological and pedagogical transformations were particularly significant in challenging Eurocentric and colonial education, as well as claiming community control over the curriculum. The 50th anniversary of the 68 movements around the world, in France, Tunisia, Senegal, and Mexico, for example, coincide with similar developments in the US, particularly on the Ocean Hill, Brownsville, in New York City, and at San Francisco State University, where the 1968 student strike, led by the Black Student Union, BSU, and the Third World Liberation Front, demanded a college for Third World Studies. The 1968 strike went beyond the liberal demand for free speech to produce a radical transformation of the curriculum, leading to the creation of the Historic College of Ethnic Studies, with departments in Africana, American Indian, Asian American, and Latinx, originally Rasa Studies. The spirit of 68 opened spaces for initiating and building the Arab and Muslim Ethnicity and Diaspora Studies program in 2007, as a pedagogical, scholarly, and communal side that challenges colonial, Islamophobic, Orientalist, and Zionist hegemonic knowledge on Arab and Muslim communities in general, and Palestine in particular. On the other hand, the emergence of Palestinian autonomous universities and their accreditation and the standards of excellence and innovation has been part and parcel of the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle and liberation movement that impacted Palestinian education under Israeli colonial rule in both the 48 and the 67 areas, as well as the refugee camps and the Palestinian exilic diaspora. Palestinian struggle for decolonizing the curriculum for future generations resonates with similar struggles elsewhere, such as the South African uprising against Bantu education, the rejection of the American Indian movement of boarding schools in North America, the insistence on resisting the English-only instructions in Puerto Rico and other colonized sites in the Western Hemisphere, and the emancipatory pedagogies of Cuba. Similar intellectual projects, theoretical frameworks, strategies, and movements have sprung up around the world, insisting on breaking the university community boundaries, validating the pedagogy of the oppressed, and demanding the decolonization of the intellect. The 68 uprisings around the world bring to focus earlier and later such struggles and call for revisiting and reimagining people, resistance, and liberation-centered curriculum and approaches. Decolonizing the curriculum, then, was effected by and contributed to the emergence of social movements that were in turn harshly suppressed by state apparatus. Examples are abound from Latin America to the Philippines, Indonesia to Mexico, Central and Southwest Asia to Northeast, Central, West, and Southern Africa. Palestine was not an exception. Throughout Palestinian history, Israel has targeted and harshly suppressed campus activism as well as the infrastructure of Palestinian education. For example, during the 2002 re-invasion, Israel destroyed several schools and educational institutions, including the buildings of the Palestinian Ministries of Education and Higher Education. During the 1987 Intifada, Israel closed Palestinian universities and schools for several years and proceeded to ban popular clandestine education and punish educators and parents for who violated this ban. The gravity of Israel's colonial rule and its assault on Palestinian education is evident in the fact that not a single commencement at any of the Palestinian universities has ever enjoyed a full graduating class. Targeting Palestinian education has been a strategic goal of the Israeli state and its research and academic institutions. Teaching Palestine, its history, geography, colonization, generations, and resistance as an emancipatory pedagogical and advocacy project outside of Palestine has also been targeted. At San Francisco State University and elsewhere in the academy, scholarship and education about and advocacy for justice in for Palestine have been subjected to relentless campaigns that seek to silence, intimidate, and bully teachers and students who study, research, and engage in the praxis of Palestine as an emancipatory pedagogical praxis, aimed at creating a chilling effect of new McCarthyism. These campaigns are launched by a well-funded and politically connected Israeli lobby network intent on stemming the expanding tide of support for justice in and for Palestine across US campuses. These attacks are not divorced from similar campaigns in the US academy that target dissenting and voices critical of neoliberalism, the rise of Trump administration, and legitimization of the alt-right and white supremacy. Targeting Palestine has been increasingly evident in pressures applied by US and other international donors agencies, such as the World Bank, to impose revisions in Palestinian curriculum in return for funding for the Palestinian Authority. And this is something that my colleagues are going, all of them are going to be relating more into that. This is also an attempt to rewrite history. The US white supremacist industry has intensified its campaign to reinstate the pre-1960s Eurocentric and colonial education to normalize as neutral genocide, slavery, racism, exclusion, and exploitation in all cases. The goal is to erase resistance strategy legacies, de-educate future generations, and produce docile citizenry that does not question but instead normalize the unjust status quo. Teaching Palestine then brings together participants who will historicize and contextualize the praxis of Palestine in its multiple manifestations and nuanced dialects. It provides much needed space to think through how to move between the inside of the classroom and the outside of campus, and above all, hold ourselves accountable to a complex, nuanced, exciting intellectual line of inquiry, and to the communities on whose lived experiences we build our careers. Building on multiple side conversations inside and outside the academy, scholars, advocates, and academics will weave theory and praxis in pedagogical, intellectual, and communal imaginaries, teaching about justice-centered knowledge production in general and in Palestine in particular. Following the Bir Zayt and the Najah conferences, teaching Palestine participants, we ensured reciprocity in intellectual community exchange and deepened the sense of solidarity. Our participants spent 1 to 2 days at different sites throughout the West Bank and the 48 areas. We unfortunately could not get to Gaza or to Lebanon. We spent a little time in Jordan. We went to on and off campuses, villages, refugee camps, and towns. We met with all sorts of people, and I'm just going to mention some of the places we were: Bir Zayt, Nablus, Jerusalem, Ramallah, Nabi Saleh, Dheisheh, Hebron, Bethlehem, Ain Hor, Haifa, Yafa, Nazareth, Arrabe, Wadi Na'im, Tel Rumede, El Hiran, Sakhnin, Arrabe, Lid, and Tel Aviv. Here at WOCMES, our beginning begins with the study of 1492. We see this as a founding moment in the settler colonial project in the Americas, with its devastating impact on indigenous communities in the Western Hemisphere, as well as the destruction of Andalusian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, and the subsequent transformation of European colonial project in Africa and Asia, and the Euro-Mediterranean societies and communities. There is much food for thought that has been given to us in the openings of the WOCMES yesterday, as well as the evening reception, that sought to what I believe is to engage in deliberate and intentional amnesia about things that has happened and rewrite the narratives of history. And this is part of what the project of Teaching Palestine aims to challenge, rewriting the narratives of defeat, submission, and subjugation, and writing the narratives of resistance, of people's struggles in order to transform the world. These sessions, as I said, are historically grounded, and we are going to be thinking about studying within the classroom, as I said, in various communities, in prisons, in formal and informal education, social movements, and activists. Each session chair will be active chair. Each session chair will do an introduction. Panelists will speak to 10 to 15 minutes. Then the panel chair will discuss and afterwards the panel chair will summarize the main points and give an opportunity for panelists to respond to each other. And then engage with you, our public here. We will then open it up for Q&A, limited to 90. So we'll have a discussion with you. We will only open it up then to panelists to comment on each other, to have a discussion, and at the end we're going to have leave time, so for the panelists to wrap up. So we will engage in this project. At the last session, which is the plenary, we are going to together reflect on the overall symposium. We will discuss issues in Palestine studies, in terms of scholarship, in terms of pedagogy, in terms of advocacy, and we will talk about future plans. So we're very happy to have you here. We're very happy that the symposium is going on, and we are happy to welcome you, and thank you all for coming. My honor and privilege to introduce my two co-panelists here. First is Professor Nacira Guenif, who is a professor of education At university, by the way, the bios are really, really long, so I'm going to only say a couple of things and move on, but we will have them all on the website along with when we do the videos. When we get the video, we need help, by the way, people have to volunteer. Nacira is Professor of Education at the University of Paris 8, Vincennes-Saint-Denis. She is also one of the leading authority on gender, Islamophobia, and race in France. And she has been working on, we've known each other actually since 2005. We met at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, in December for Arab American Studies, where we had discussion of laïcité and the imposition of the dress code by the French authorities on students in schools. So Nacira's topic is going, I'm going to also introduce Raz. Nacira's topic is indigent and auto-theme in times of post-coloniality, teaching from the invisible. The second speaker is also my honor to introduce my former professor, mentor, and friend now, Raz Petchesky, who is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Hunter College at City University of New York. She is a winner of the MacArthur Genius Award, and she is now active with the Jewish Voice for Peace. And Raz's topic title is Can the Infiltrators Speak? Teaching the History of Racism and White Supremacy in Zionist Ideology and Practice. My topic is going to be the spirit of 68 in context, Islamophobia, coloniality, and emancipatory pedagogies. I presented much of it in my introduction, so I will invite Nacira first.
Thank you very much, Rabab, for this very friendly and generous introduction, and for setting the, setting the scene and the frame for what we are going to discuss today. I'm very much honored to be part of this symposium, and have been invited by you to take part in the project. Hopefully it will take place next year in University. So my intention and my position in this symposium is quite challenging, because I will maybe first introduce myself, which is something that you've partly done, but maybe it needs a more specific explanation. So I'm addressing the topic that is part of this morning session from the perspective of the matter of entitlement, and from a situated non-knowledgeable about Palestine position, building knowledge on France and New America, systemic and systematic racism translating into widespread routine of dispossession, dismissing, and denial of French citizens, migrants, exiled refugees who live in France and Europe, with a gender, racialization, sexualization, and ethnical perspective. Rather, I'm acting as a reflection and reflecting service to bring into light how Palestine circulates along field research that led me, and this might be surprising to you, but it obviously is not anymore to me, to New Caledonia, a colonial territory that still belongs to France, and that will undergo independence, autodetermination referendum next November in order to decide whether it becomes independent or remains under the French sovereignty, including the Autochthones people, the Indigenes people that lives there, who was colonized and expropriated from his land, who are called the Kanak. So, and what is interesting is that New Caledonia was a place I visited thanks to a Palestinian friend of mine who was interested in the place because of this kind of circulations, not only of emotions, friendships, but also of struggles and of political dimensions of what it means to be under a colonial rule in the 21st century. So I also speak as a reflecting surface from a recent experience that took place in my university, where exiled, homeless, undocumented men, majority of men, young men, who survived the whole journey from Eastern and Western Africa, occupied in the Department of Art classrooms at the University Paris in Saint-Denis. And Saint-Denis is a very wide migrant and post-colonial migrant community where the university stands. So those people literally live next door to our university, and at the same time these people entered the university in the middle of the winter when it was freezing. They were freezing on the streets in order to live there, and they lived there until the end of June, when they were expelled by the police under the request of the president of the university. So this is also from this perspective that I'm speaking to this and addressing the question of where Palestine speaks to other dimensions of struggle. So those people, rather than to be viewed as survivors, which they were viewed as undesirable invaders, not only in France, but also in the university where I teach. So my intention, which I will not exhaust during this talk, since we are to save time for conversation and discussion, can be summarized this way. So I will not go through all of it, but I want to share this with you. Apart from the reclaim of the Indigene label by some decolonial activists in the First World, the Indigene Autochtone binary is not supposed to centrally reflect the current state of power relations involved in colonial settings, whether they enact settler colonialism or an internal colonial domestication. Yet, if one looks closely at urban planning, population mapping, and state policies, the divide between autochtone and indigenes and its invisible aim may well help decipher current ways of deepening the gap between legitimate citizens, second-rate ones, and aliens, which include refugees and exiles. Drawing on locations in comparatively distant places across the globe, Northwestern Territories in Canada, where the First Nations live and still are, New Caledonia, which I just explained, Palestine and France, this paper intends to explore and take seriously, therefore not for granted, the embodiment and government of indigeneity and autochthony as part of labeling device or as a tool to reclaim such label and talk back. It would be about unearthing the ambivalence and binary it encompasses, its boundary blurring possibilities, and what it takes in terms of teaching how to unlearn and study such dynamics in order to reshape the terms of negotiations and the face of resistance. So I will try to attend to a few questions that I will share with you. I do not intend to exhaust them, but rather to raise them. So, attending the question of Palestinian autochthony. So this might sound a bit strange to think of Palestinians as autochthones. As you know, this is a Greek word that relates human beings and humanness to roots and to land. So it makes sense, after all. Despite the fact that Palestinians on the international scene never claimed their status as autochthones of the land from which they were expelled. And this thought came to me when I was in Canada interacting with not only individuals, activists, but also with academics from the First Nations, who are engaged in a very deep negotiation with the Canadian state in order to renegotiate all the treaties that were once signed with the Queen and the King and the Queen and so on and so forth, with the British Crown. So that's interesting that from the Canadian perspective, and especially regarding the fact that the Palestinian struggle speaks to First Nation activists that very frequently refer to what is happening now and what happened in the past to the Palestinians in order to feed themselves with some understanding of how reconciliation, for example, just to mention this ongoing policy and state policy, federal policy in the Canadian sphere, they would refer not only to the civic movement of African Americans or to the independence movements. For example, there is this very interesting book by Glenn Coulard called Red Skin, White Masks that explicitly refer to Frantz Fanon and, of course, to the Algerian Revolution, but also to other different struggles that are taking place in Brazil, for example, with the reclaim of the land. So that's interesting that with regard to what I discovered as I discentered myself from the French case was that there was this direct connection in terms of autochthony between what's happening with the native nations in North America and what is not happening in terms of negotiation, in terms of framing what is usually called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so that is something that I wanted to maybe bring to the conversation. What autochthony as a reclaim, as a definition, as an international category that is recognized, for example, by the United Nations, what would it do to what we understand, what we can learn from the Palestinian, not only situation, but struggle, and the genealogy of the Palestinian struggle. So this is one point I wanted to raise, and I think that based on the land ownership, on reclaiming the land, as it was recently and powerfully demonstrated by the marches of return to the land, but also return to what can possibly be a one-state solution, under which condition is about negotiating not only the ownership, but the status of the land, maybe beyond the ownership of the land, the status of the land. So with regard to all these different events, the question of expulsion and dispossession can be put in relation with the question of autochthony. So what if in any kind of future, I mean, close or distant, the Palestinians were recognized as Autochthones, with reference, for example, of Bedouin culture, to mention just one, but we could think of many others. What would it change in the way the whole relation to Palestinian struggle, to the Palestinian issue, what would it do to this perception and to the international reference in relation to Palestine? There is another issue I wanted to raise in the time that is left to me, is about escaping, with regard precisely to what I just said. This helps us also escaping exceptionalism that is so often related to Palestine. You know, this is an exception. Everything else in the world is quite, you know, is going on quite well. You know, Palestine is some sort of an exception or a queer experience of the international order. If we escape exceptionalism to lay out a paradigmatic Palestine that speaks to its own specificity and simultaneously to all its sides, this would also be interesting in terms of using the pattern that Rabab is suggesting about teaching Palestine, then teaching Palestine is about excavating all the ties that are between Palestine and different places in the world. So, and I wanted also to address something and pay attention to something that is quite vivid in your minds for sure. I will now, maybe I can just show you this map that gives you some sense of what I'm trying to explain very briefly. You may know these maps. Palestine has been mapped now and again for so much time, and it will probably go on for a while. And what this shows is a sense of what I would suggest to call islandization, how to build islands on land, and how to islandize, sort of, through walls, camps, colonies, and body borders, the individual body becoming literally a border, a moving border across space, as a means of isolation and disruption of not only cohesion and communities, but also of coalition and resistance endeavors. And this was also something that came to my mind as I was thinking of New Caledonia and other places that France knows about, especially when it comes to divide and rule, by using the island topography and topology. France has islands as colonial possessions in the Atlantic, northern Atlantic, close to Canada, by the way. It's the only white colonial space. All the others are colored or black. Indian Ocean, New Caledonia. Everywhere France has islandized islands. It has divided, including inside the islands, in order to rule them more efficiently. And this speaks also to what is happening in Palestine and to the Palestinian territory. So this notion of islandization and islandization is something that could also help us understand how to dis-islandize. Also, another thing I wanted to add to the conversation is tracking what drawing on Sarah's Ahmed Promise of Happiness. You may know this book. She has written about the grammar of happiness. One may view as a happy secularism. A happy secularism, which would emotionally stand for Zionism in times of pinkwashing and whitewashing, especially when you look at scenes that are displayed and promoted all across the internet. I will just mention two of them, which is Tel Aviv and Haifa. So this happy secularism also is being confronted and being denounced by the way First Nations, by the way all colonial settler situations are being addressed today. Okay, so let me wrap up. So against that, I would suggest to open up against all odds Palestine as a location and let it stream as a meaningful current and spread as a metaphor of creolization, to refer to the Vincennes notion that builds worldliness. So teaching from what is now not acknowledged yet, or always already overlooked, redirecting the gaze toward what is at the same time too visible, the whiteness hegemony, and invisibilized in the mode of an undisclosed secret, strategically and unsurprisingly to its sole beneficiaries by the blunt device of entitlement, thus closing the vicious circle, namely its whiteness. I'm here speaking for white male heterosexist mode of existence and its hegemony, meaning an enduring colonial occupation of the lands, the hands, and the minds. Occupation in the form of oppression relying on exploitation, economic and symbolic. Let's not forget about the symbolic exploitation, from which derive benefits that reinforce the status quo and in the form of expropriation from one's land and one's mind. We have learned how, by enslavement, about which we still have to address and come to terms with what happened in enslavement. But also from expropriation from one's own body by means of failing, exploiting, humiliating, and domesticating, and ultimately by mere erasure, killing and blaming the victim for her own and his own death in order to throw suspicion on her or his mourning and loss. I'm simply describing here a scheme witnessed in various points of the globe. This is not just Palestine. Furthermore, it's also the case in France about people living and dying at the hands of the French police. And trying to connecting the dots between those isolated points in order to imagine a teaching in which Palestine is no more an exception, but a paradigmatic example of what runs across the world under various disguises. Purposefully, with their own interest powers in place, intend to extend indefinitely the state of affairs, and some righteously endeavor to disrupt the hegemonic order. One of the tools I'm pointing at is teaching to speak out, but also teaching to keep the secret undisclosed. Not everything has to be made public, and this is something that we also learned from the Palestinian history. It's about to keep the secrets for oneself. And to say that, just to conclude, Tamara Sarsour, whom work you may know, she recently displayed a new piece that she called "They Ate the Most in the Most Refined Porcelain." She says that instead of making more documentaries, she'd rather now reinvent narratives and disseminating them across the world through science fiction. Maybe we should take seriously science fiction as something to recreate and re-elaborate about new undercurrents and new commonalities. Thank you.
I'd rather sit here and listen to Nacira and Rabab. I'll do my job. First of all, I have to thank my dear and teacher as well as student, Rabab Abdulhadi, Professor Abdulhadi, whose political, intellectual, and moral leadership shows us the way that you can be active to demand the justice for Palestine at the same time as de-exceptionalizing and putting Palestine in the context of global situations of injustice. I also want to make two disclaimers. One, it occurred to me there's a problem criticizing sites like Israel and Zionism, which I will do. When you come from a country which has been the most profoundly outrageous dispossessor of indigenous peoples, I think, in the history of the planet, and continues to be, to deport, to oppress, to racialize. So I feel shame about that as well as anger. And second disclaimer, I am not a Middle East specialist at all. I come to this work as a feminist political theorist and human rights scholar and an activist in Jewish Force for Peace. I think it's a pedagogy to be reclaimed in two things, two methodologies. Mining history to see the present newly, and thinking together, it's what I always try to do with my students, thinking together to uncover not answers, but the questions we should be asking. So I'm going to see this as a kind of pedagogy, and I'm going to focus it on what I'm calling the infiltrators, or the discourse of infiltrators, but also defectors. The infiltrators and defectors as a kind of relationship. I understand Zionism in the context of other European racisms, nationalisms, and colonialisms, and as such, remind us that all racisms, nationalisms, and colonialisms to operate must police not only their others, but also their presumed beneficiaries. In other words, settlers, like the subordinate or colonized, must be made, as we learned from Penrose and McClintock and others. I think that, for me, the frameworks of settler colonialism, apartheid, and neoliberal racialized capitalism are not mutually exclusive, but very reinforcing of one another. They are analytical frameworks that operate in layered simultaneity in the Palestinian context. My argument is really that Zionism as an ideology and a set of practices and policies from its origins became a racist system of settler colonialism and apartheid in two ways. Its historical alignment with European assumptions about Western and white superiority, and its attempts to racialize, whiten, and nationalize Jews, equating Jewishness with allegiance to the exclusive Jewish state. I don't claim at all that the consequences for Jews are equivalent to those catastrophic consequences for Palestinians. Please don't think I'm saying that in any way. But I do want to make the point that discrimination and exclusion against Jews who don't fit or who don't adhere to the Orthodox ethno-nationalist code is also a consequence of Zionism. And I think that we need, part of what I'm trying to do here is to keep in sight, and Nacira, you refer to something like this, the hierarchy of disposability. The aliens, the infiltrators, the semi-citizens, the non-citizens, the citizens, that whole hierarchy, those racialized tiers should get us away from a kind of binary thinking of the oppressed and the oppressor. It doesn't work here. In order to understand, for example, just to make a few examples, the ambiguous positioning of Mizrahi Jews. And I'll talk about that later. But why something happens, like in the town of Afula recently, where the residential committee demanded the exclusion of an Arab family, and these were mainly Mizrahi Jews, who had themselves been excluded, discriminated against. How does that happen? Why does that happen? We need to go deeper into what systems of racism do to different populations. Recently in Mondoweiss, a writer, Jonathan Ophir, some of you might know he's a musician, he's a lovely writer, he's not even professionally a journalist, but Jonathan Ophir was writing in Mondoweiss about an incident in the Knesset recently, where a Likud representative named Miki Zohar, crazy guy, gets up in the Knesset and he says, he's commenting on something about the case against Netanyahu, but in any case he says, the public in the state of Israel is a public which belongs to the Jewish race, and the whole Jewish race is the greatest human capital and the smartest and most understanding, and sometimes also the most educated. That's a very embarrassing thing. Well, Ophir's response to this was to say, oh my God, this is so terrible. Why aren't all the pundits and the journalists up in arms about this? And I say, why be surprised? This is inherent in Zionist ideology. It's only coming out into the surface, just like we have in the US. Trump is bringing things out into the surface that have been there from the beginning of the United States of America. So I don't know how many of you were in the session. I thought it was a very, very interesting session yesterday on should there be a Jewish state? And Rabbi Rabkin was great in that. I thought he was very interesting in locating the idea of the chosen people in a kind of Protestant evangelical tradition, which, by the way, even Orthodox Jewish Zionists latched onto gleefully, incorporated in their theology, which became an ideology. I draw from many sources. What I like very much is Shlomo Sand. You might disagree, but I like his work. And he also looks at this idea of Jews as an uprooted race, a messianic people, a chosen people, and what he calls the nationalization of the Bible and its transformation into a reliable history book. And he connects it with Protestant traditions in the 19th and early 20th century. My good friend in JVP, Svia, who is an Israeli anti-Zionist, she talks about God as a real estate agent. And many historians, Gabriel Peterberg and others, Ilan Pape and so on, this attempt to use historiography and cartography to make a Jewish people, to resurrect a Jewish people who were continuous through time and space somehow, which, by the way, was a very patriarchal tradition, not so good for women at all. My grandmother didn't want it done. And one could ask, is Zionism in this sense any different from other ethno-nationalisms in their search for biocultural origins and authenticity? Why is it different? How is it different? Not so different in some ways. Sand, of course, argues that this myth of a common ethnos contradicts reality. It's kind of crazy in a way. When you look at people practicing Judaism in just about every culture, religion, foods, languages across the globe, as you find Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and so on. It's ridiculous, this idea of a national identity which becomes racialized, a Jewish race. But still, as Sand reminds us, this is not nationalism until it becomes focused on land, territoriality, and in a Weberian sense, the idea of the nation state as requiring a fixed land with fixed borders. You still have to ask why Palestine. And of course, there's the mystique of the promised land, this whole sort of biblical thing. But as Professor Carmi yesterday in the session some of us attended, she was terrific, from the University of Exeter, reminds us, that accomplishing this magical feat of bringing all these very diverse people together as one nation people also had to coincide. It's just too tricky. It had to coincide with major geopolitical interests, particularly of the British and later U.S. imperial interests. I would argue that it also had racist elements. If you look at some historical work on, for example, the Jewish Colonization Association operating in Russia and trying to convince potential refugees that they should not go to alternative sites. Herschel talked about Uganda and Cyprus and Latin America. It didn't matter particularly to him, get the Jews out of Europe. He was very anti-Semitic. But they would use warnings about, you'll become like the blacks. You'll be eaten up by insects if you go to Africa. That Jews were Western. They had to remain civilized, unlike those others. So that was a part of it, I think, why Palestine, and I think we need to remember it. And then, of course, the British influence, the Balfour Declaration, which promised to the Jews, why favor the Jews? That's a good question. Why favor the Jews? Because the British definitely did. They gave Zionism and Zionist separate colonialism an imprimatur. But to have a Western bastion in the region to bolster British imperial interests, and later the US would operate in a similar way. And the point I want to make, this is all well known, but this combined with the idea of a land, the myth of the land without a people, is a white supremacist erasure of Palestinian Arabs. And I want to locate it in the pedagogy of racism and anti-racism. There are many expressions of these racist attitudes. I could give you so many examples in the 19th, but particularly in the early 20th century. You've got a letter from, for example, from Chaim Weizmann to Balfour in 1918, using very stereotypical derogatory slurs to refer to Arabs as inherently treacherous and deceitful. You've got a letter from the revered Reform Rabbi Judah Magnus, liberal guy in the US, writing to Weizmann in 1929, disparaging the Palestine Arabs as still half-savage and their leaders almost all small men. And there were early attempts to solidify these racist ideas into claims over land. If you look at the Jewish Agency Constitution from 1929, which began the Jewish National Fund, which would become the instrument for Judaicizing most Palestinian land in the 20th century, concretized in law in 1960. The Constitution of the Jewish Agency says in 1929 that Jewish National Fund land is the inalienable property of the Jewish people, and that it is not obliged to act for the good of all its citizens, but for the good of the Jewish people only. This is before there was a state. It's still talking about citizens. It's incredible. I was interested in this, looking at roots of this racist ideology in my own home community. I grew up, unfortunately, in a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. I went back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I found documents. I looked in the archives of my Jewish community where my grandparents and my parents lived, and were very strong Zionists, as Reformed Jews, by the way. And I found a document from 1936, note, very important year of massive Palestinian uprisings against the British Mandate authorities and a big influx of Jews into Palestine. In that time, the local Tulsa rabbis were telling the congregants this Zionist dogma, which I would argue it was probably, I don't have, I haven't done the research, but I would bet it was common in cities and towns across the Midwest where Jews had settled and left the East Coast, like my grandparents. In this one writing, the rabbi says, the Arab masses did not resent the Jewish immigration because it brought to them more prosperity and material advancement in a decade than they had known in a millennium, and would be the source of their earthly happiness. Their earthly happiness. Interesting to me, he was very aware of comparisons to treatment the American Indian received at the hands of the white intruder, but he insisted that Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine was different. It was more benevolent because of this very common racist colonialist trope that Jewish European settlers brought superior intellectual and technological capacity to Palestine and would improve the lands they falsely portrayed as barren and neglected. This comes right, I refer you to a book by Gary Fields, a wonderful book called Enclosure, that compares Palestine and Zionism, Zionist ideology, with the enclosure movements in 17th century England and colonies. It's very interesting and important. So these assumptions of cultural superiority are infused in Zionist ideology from the start. Of course, the main perpetrator of all of this, and the most powerful one, David Ben-Gurion. And what Ben-Gurion brings to this, he adopts all of this. I'm done. He's saying I'm done.
Keep going.
Keep going. Keep going.
Keep going.
Oh, okay. He brings the very important, again, Weberian concept of sovereignty, of hegemony, supremacy. Not just bring Jews to the land, not just the ingathering, but they must control the land. Early as 1937, Ben-Gurion was talking about a favorable demographic balance and that it would probably necessitate the use of force. In a speech in 1947, he pronounced that only a state with at least 80% Jews is a viable and stable state. So thus begins the demographic war. A very interesting moment was 1941, and note this is considerably before awareness of the full horror of the Nazi Holocaust. The Holocaust hadn't really happened in 1941. And in 1941, in a place called Newport in Britain, 20 male Zionist leaders, 3 Rothschilds, Simon Marx at Marks and Spencer, Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, in other words, an elite white Ashkenazi patriarchate, meet in this place. And Ben-Gurion and Weizmann try to convince the others, and they succeed, that a Jewish homeland has to mean a Jewish state with a Jewish majority and a Jewish name, Eretz Yisrael. Nothing else would do. And of course, this had two strategies involved. One, to de-Arabize Palestine by instigating the voluntary transport out of the Arab population and massive in-migration of Jewish immigrants who wanted to go to their promised land. So I'm arguing from the beginning, from even before 1948, and of course all this sets up for the Nakba, Plan Dalet, the Nakba, all that follows. I want to take a few minutes, can I? Oh, 2 minutes, okay. Just to emphasize that there were consequences also for Jews. Many Jews did not want to go to Palestine. My grandparents were Russian immigrants. They suffered the pogrom. My grandmother suffered Orthodox Jewish misogyny. Her father, Orthodox rabbi, burned all her books, insisted she couldn't study because she was a girl. But they didn't want to. And there was a tremendous, and this is something that needs more research, but there's been significant research already of the efforts of Zionist groups to gear and steer Jewish refugees from Europe, from Russia, to Israel. Very significant efforts. In the case of the Russian refugees in the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure put on Ronald Reagan, and Reagan, colluded with this, to put quotas on Jewish immigrants, so they would go to Israel. And this is when Yitzhak Shamir calls the Russians Jews who did not want to go to Israel, defectors. Infiltrator, the language of the infiltrator, I don't have time to go into it, but it is actually very much in all the early laws of the new state of Israel in the 1948 to 53, the 1950, the right of return law, the 1954 prevention of infiltration law, this idea, and it was directed immediately to all those Palestinians who tried to return to their homes, reclaim their lands and property after being forcibly expelled during the Nakba, and still called infiltrators, as are, as you know, the African asylum seekers called infiltrators. So there's a long, long legacy of this. And I'll just finish, I have lots more to say, of course, but saying that this history and this understanding really needs to be incorporated into our teaching across the board. I think it needs to be incorporated into the, when we teach about racism and racialization in academic courses on race, ethnicity, immigration, gender studies, Jewish studies, comparative colonial studies, international relations. And we also try to create study groups and informal ways of learning and teaching. In Jewish Voice for Peace, we bring to synagogues, mosques, churches, community centers, youth groups. We created this document that's called Confronting Zionism, which is a set of personal testimonies about experiences of growing up in many different age groups, some Israeli, one Palestinian, some Ashkenazi Jews, and Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, and we converted it into a theatrical piece. We wrote a theater piece, and we perform it in various audiences as a way of rethinking Zionism. Thank you.
We're doing okay. You have 10, 10, 16, 10, 17. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I will take just a couple of few minutes and then actually try to I've already made a lot of points before, but I was trying to think how can I actually bridge and speak to what Nacira and Rabab spoke and raised questions about the topic I was speaking about. So, no, this is mine actually. Oh yeah, this is mine and I returned the one. And so let me actually engage with a little bit of history about what does 68 mean and how the way it is studied and why is it that we're talking about 1492 and 1968. 1492 is to always contextualize the positionality where we're in, to understand what does it mean we're here in Seville. What does it mean to be in a place that actually the history of had a huge impact on the places many of us, are in the academy, specifically those of us who are actually creating this project. And one of the important things to understand about the Arab and Muslim literacy and Diasporas studies program is that we are housed in the Historic College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University that came about as a result of the 1968 student strike at San Francisco State that called for the creation of a college of third world studies. The university turned around and gave the students, by way of compromise, a college of ethnic studies. The very naming, the slippage from a college of third world studies to a college of ethnic studies signifies a different shift in thinking and framing. What does it mean to think about the project of decolonizing the curriculum in 1968, which was the project of the students who led the strike. It began by students in the Black Student Union, but soon after they formed something called Third World Liberation Front, and went by Third World Liberation Front, actually. They stopped actually talking about the Black Student Union, and some of the students were inside the university, some students were outside of the university. And this is one of the dichotomous representations in the sense that it only speaks about what happened with the students, does not talk about the alliances that were formed around the students from the faculty, and it wasn't just Black students, it was American Indian movement was actually quite involved. Richard Oakes, who took over the Alcatraz Island, was a student at some point at San Francisco State University, and today we have a room called Richard Oakes Multicultural Center. The League of Filipino Students, who were very much fighting against the military dictatorship in the Philippines, were very much involved. The students from the Chicano Moratorium, who were fighting against the war in Vietnam, were very much involved in the San Francisco State strike. Third World Liberation Front actually was the third word, and the understanding of third wordism was, in a sense, understanding of the third word, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the third within, quote-unquote, the first word. So these were the connections. And the reason they actually named the Third World Liberation Front, had to do with the people who actually started the strike, who were part of the Black Panther Party, that had the different understanding of what the communities of color in places like the US, which is a settler colony, how do we understand the location of communities of color vis-a-vis indigenous communities? So there is a big contradiction in the College of Ethnic Studies in the sense that ethnic studies contains something called American Indian Studies or Indigenous Studies, lumps in ethnic communities, and which is, forget about the sociology naming of race and ethnicity. Ethnicity becomes it's a very different name, but it's a very different animal there. But in this here, constructing indigenous communities and communities of color as part of ethnic studies signifies being part of the nation state. Let's say of the US nation state, of the Canadian nation state, which may speak then to the question of, does it work? If we want to talk about Palestine, does it work actually for the Palestinians to think of themselves as an autochthonous? Because there are different nations or different indigenous communities in different parts of the world. Not all the communities are seeking renegotiation of treaties. Not all communities recognize the powers, not only the treaties, the powers that created the treaties. They think of these treaties as completely illegitimate, and they refuse. Like the Palestinians in 1947 refused the partition plan and continue until today to refuse the partition plan. They thought it was unfair then, and they continue to think it's unfair now. They reject the Balfour Declaration and they demand reparations, apology, and completely cancellation of it. And okay, but if there is a big thing about what people are demanding, what might happen, and so on, that's a different discussion for political science, spaces, and so on, or if you want to think about future possibilities. But in this sense, there is a very big difference between what do you think about when you think about ethnic studies and the context, the concept of the assimilation of minoritized, and I'm saying minoritized and I'm putting it in parentheses, I'm not talking about minority majority. How do minoritized communities fit in the assimilationist nation state? And who belongs and who doesn't belong, and who believes they belong and who doesn't believe that they belong. So it's one thing about how they are viewed. The second aspect is how they view themselves. And this is very interesting that if we take it to the Palestinian context and we think about the transformation of Palestinian identification in different parts of the Palestinianness, let's say, because different, there is inside 48, there is the West Bank, there is Gaza, there is the refugees, there is the exilic diaspora, and so on. The ways in which the identity changes and shifts around. And I think one of the, rather than having engaged in a very big discussion, because we will never be able to get back to our topic, but it is part of the how to teach Palestine in this particular way. What is it that we teach about it? Is if we think, and I would argue, about Palestinians in the 48 areas that were named as the Arabs of Israel, the Arabs of Israel, or Israeli Arabs. And some claimed, some accepted. I think in a way we can think about the ways in which African Americans, the different ways of the naming and so on, from the N-word to Negroes to people of color to colored people to African Americans to black with a capital B, black, or Africans, and some people say Africans or some people say Afrikaans. So there is multiple namings. But I'm saying that for comparative purposes. I'm not saying this exactly fits. We cannot conflate the two examples, and I think they definitely do not fit exactly the same. But if you think about the way the Palestinian Forum, Israeli Arabs, the way they, and Israel continues to call Arabs. It says the people inside Israel Arabs, and there is Palestinians in the West Bank, and it becomes very confusing for people who don't understand. But to the Palestinians who actually claim Arabness, as in Mahmoud Darwish says, write down I'm an Arab, which is a defiance of that I do have a nationality called Arabness, which this is a nationality of resistance, nationalisms of resistance, not nationalism of the oppression, which is very different animals as well, when you talk about liberation movements and so on. To the Palestinians calling themselves, we are Palestinians. And to the penalties that the Israeli state places upon them. So this is one aspect of it. The second aspect of it that I think that the comparative analysis gives us a lot of opportunities, but also gives us a lot of limitations. Because when we think about that, and a lot of people tend to actually compare the situation of blacks in, let's say, the United States with the Palestinians. And I argue that I don't think this is, actually I think indigeneity works similarly, but there is limitations with that. Okay, but then you come into, and actually blacks in the United States does not really compare as well to Mizrahi or Sephardic communities in Israel, because the manner by which Mizrahi Sephardic communities arrived in Israel irrespective of the fact that there were bombs placed in the synagogues in Iraq that pushed many to relocate to Israel, and despite the many ways in which the racial fabric and Ella Shohat and many others write about that, despite that, there is a very big difference in the fact that Africans were actually kidnapped and enslaved, and their bodies became property. Okay, so this is it's a different way. There is racism and there is racial, and I think the conflation and equating the two and putting them with each other is very problematic. I think that we need to be paying attention to a lot of historical kind of like how these things causes and then have happened. And then within the African American community, for example, there is also different ways of seeing it. So I go back to the Black Panther because there was a Black Panther in Israel that was inspired by the US Black Panthers. But there is also ways in which the Black Panther Party in Israel actually appealed to the state in some places and actually accepted the Zionist discourse, which speaks to the accepted, earlier, not later on, but earlier accepted the Zionist discourse and actually appealed and held things in the Independence Street and did a lot of the things that had to do, that some of it were the Black Panthers in the US have never ever accepted the US nation state, have always insisted on the right of indigenous people, have always called the United States imperialism. I mean, they have they've never called themselves Americans. They do not call themselves African Americans. They call themselves black. And sometimes for a lack of another term. So there is a different way of understanding the dynamics and the relationship with it, which leads me to, and with many things to discuss here, just but amazing, I think, which leads me to how does this then connect with what we are talking about here in terms of the 68 and coming back to San Francisco and the whole question of decolonizing the curriculum. How do we teach about Palestine in a context in which we are locked in a theoretical framework of ethnic studies? Does Palestine become a Palestinian American project, i.e. Palestinians who are assimilated into Americanness and looking to Washington at the center of gravity, or Palestinians as a transnational concept in the sense that Palestinians are transnationally imagined and being everywhere? How do we think about that in terms of the US settler colonial project and the Israeli settler colonial project? How do Palestinians fit into that? And where do the Palestinian rise? How do we speak about the Palestinian rise? How do we speak about the Palestinian discourse? And one of the reasons we actually, the project, the advocacy aspect of the project and the public engagement aspect of the project, we started it about 2 years ago, was to think about, do we think about only when we say occupation 50 years, 67, or do we think about 100 years of Balfour, or do we think about 70 years of Nakba? Or do we think about when colonialist project began? Do we begin, is the beginning, the genesis, the same way as the naming of quote-unquote post-colonial studies that signals that colonialism stays at the center of analysis? If we place the people about whom we want to study, Palestinians, at the center of analysis, Palestinians with all variations and all contradictions and all historically and contemporary. If we place at the center, how might we then stop talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in conflict terms and talk about it in different languages as a question of indigeneity, as a question of self-determination, as a question of a community under siege, as different. How does it differ when we do that? How does the analysis differ when we are talking about participants who are very much invested in what's going on, for instance, what Raz is talking about, the question of Jews across history, and we can't talk about one Jew, one form of Jewishness. There is multiple forms of historically and so on. But let's say today, Jews who are actually in solidarity with Palestinian self-determination, how do you think about the location and the participation in the Palestinian Liberation Project? How does that fit, and how does it work, and which Jews in what part, and how does this work vis-a-vis other people? And how is it that we can think about the strategic location of Jewishness that refuses to allow Israel to speak in its name, vis-a-vis other people who are constructed as not invested or not sufficiently invested in the liberation of Palestine, and thus need to take a second or a third seat to Palestinians and Jews, because Palestinians and Jews own it. Okay? How do we think about all the other communities, and do those other communities have less second class, third class? So within solidarity, within actually the movements for solidarity, within the question of pedagogical praxis towards the indivisibility of justice, how do we place other people and go back to the project of the decolonizing knowledge, and actually the project in 1968 that said that we are not being taught as black students, as indigenous, as Asians, as African Americans, as Latinos, we are not being taught about our own communities. Our experiences are not validated and legitimized. What the knowledge that comes out of our country is completely disregarded because it's not seen as mainstream, legitimate knowledge, as a lot of the panels here at WOCMES, as you know, are. And thus what we do is devalued. Or maybe it is assigned second place, and maybe somebody is brought in just to kind of like have a little bit diversity, multiculti, neoliberal, multiculturalism, and so on. How does that get placed in there? And what sort of a balance, or should be a balance? Should we really have a balance between these various things to kind of like say, okay, today we do this, tomorrow we do. How do we do it? And how do we do it in a place where this is not centered? When the communities, the people, the marginalized, the colonized, the people who are intended to be voiceless, intended and accepting also that sometimes silence is a very important strategy of resistance. I agree. But how do we place those stories, those topics, those curricula, those histories, and how do we define the oversimplification and superficial analysis, and at the same time insist that it is at the end the question, it is a simple question, it's not too complicated about justice and injustice. So how do we weave all of these things together? Become really one of the biggest tasks that we need, and it takes us back to the whole process of decolonizing knowledge and what responsibilities we as scholars have towards the communities from whose lives we live. Thank you. We'll take 2-3 comments and then pass them out. So. Okay, so anybody else? One person here? Anyone? No? Oh, no. Okay, go ahead. While people are formulating the question. And can you just say your name and your institution, please?
Sure. So my name is Brooke, and I'm here from Berkeley and Sonoma State Universities. And thank you for comments. I can't bring everything together, but I wanted to just comment a little bit on what Dr. Abdulhadi was talking about in terms of some of the questions that come up with how to sort of address these core issues from the place of ethnic studies and kind of the history of the way that ethnic studies has arisen. And I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about, and I hear your sense of like the problematic way that ethnic studies got named from the demand for a third world studies, but I think I wanted to suggest that like a couple things. So one is that I think that ethnic studies is potentially a sort of a place where we could think in a sort of multi-strategy and more flexible way. And it's not unlike other kind of anti-disciplinary forms that come up at the same time, like American studies, feminist studies, queer studies, trans studies, that unlike area studies, like Middle East studies, that was more invested in by U.S. imperial politics, these other ones I want to suggest they are able to take in some of the disciplinary formations, but they also kind of work against that compartmentalization. and they allow for, I think, the kind of like more multiple perspectives that you're calling out here, where we can do maybe some, you know, comparative racialization, or comparative studies of race. We can do some, you know, studies that take in other kinds of field work, and then also go away from a particular place, maybe a look at diaspora or other kinds of relations. So I think that actually even within the disciplines, you know, they're looking to the interdisciplines and the anti-disciplines for that kind of flexible thinking. So I feel like somewhat encouraged by that. But one of the things that I guess I want to bring up with the idea of third world studies is that, you know, because of the intensity of racism in the United States, where we're talking about some of these things are coming up, I think sometimes we have a really racial response to that. And I think that I just want to ask the question about how that's working, and also what kinds of maybe collaborations that can be foreclosing, especially in a situation where racial difference and ethnic difference have actually become valuable, like they've been commodified in this kind of neoliberal market that the university is working in. So like you say, like multicultural differences are going to get called up for their value, adding a little spice to the mix or whatever. And I think that this is going to sound crazy, but one of the things that was happening in the SF student strike is that actually a lot of white working class students were deeply involved with that strike. And one of the things that they were talking about was the problem of the kinds of inequalities that were happening within the university, where working class students were being trapped into vocational types of situations. And I think that part of the call for an ethnic, I mean, this is just really what happened in 1968 at SF State, is there was a huge white working class population that was being trapped into these kinds of lower level degrees. And I think that one of the things that students were asking for, and maybe are still asking for in student movements, is to actually have effects on the world and on their lives through what they're studying, and not merely be trapped into these kinds of jobs. Obviously capitalism is super intensified and we need jobs, but I guess one of my questions is is ethnic studies, or are these other kinds of anti-disciplinary formations spaces where those kinds of collaborations are still potential, even given that racism is obviously demobilizing the possibility for doing the kinds of cultural studies that we were asking for?
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel.
Go ahead.
And I would like
Could you
to
introduce yourself?
my name is Saad Al-Khidra. I'm a English geographer teaching at Najat National University in Nablus, Palestine. Occupied Palestine, still occupied. I would like to bring in the comparative perspective as a political geographer, and building on what Professor Nacira said about the islandization. You know, the colonials always like divide and rule, but you have the issue of fragmented geography, you fragment the identity. But it goes dialectically in a different direction too. Like, if we say the Balkanization they try to do the Balkanization in South Africa, that actually solidified the identity of the blacks fighting. So in one point is fragmenting, and in our case, we're going to do the Bantustanization, but they try to fragment our geography, to fragment our identity between Gaza and the West Bank, and the same in indigenous people in the United States, they put them in Indian reservations. This dialectic between fragmentation and the resistance to bridge the identity across these, transcend these islandization. So the tactics of how we can, so if you can comment on that, please, or your ideas about that. I'm going to come back to this.
Okay, I'm Terry Ginsberg from American University in Cairo, and I just have a quick question for all three of you. I mean, the answer may seem self-evident, but I'd like to hear an articulation of your understanding of the function of the concept of class and or political economy in the paradigm of race that you're applying. Do you understand it as other, in addition to, in relation to the discourse and critique of imperialism and colonialism?
Are we good? Okay, so.
Actually,
let me just say there is a sign-up sheet going around. If you would like to stay in touch with us, please add your information.
Thank you for this question. As you may understand, I am kind of improvising and trying to decolonize knowledge and see what can be brought into the conversation, this kind of new neologism that I just invented, islandization. Whatever it brings to the conversation, I think is good because it's kind of decenters our routines of thinking so that we have some sort of challenge in order to maybe reconsider the way we think about not only geographies but also geographies of the minds. And so I completely agree with you that there is this very interesting kind of dialectics going on. You took the example of South Africa, and if I were to maybe bring back the example of New Caledonia, which is interesting in that respect. New Caledonia is an ensemble of islands. There is a large one, principal one, and 3 or 4, 5 small ones. And interestingly, the way France ruled these new territories is that it took the land of the main island. It was a penal colony, it was a settler colony, it was, it had many different purposes. It was very effective up until now. This is why France wants to keep it in its own sovereignty. But the other small lands, islands, remained the property of the indigenous groups. The land was not taken from them, which is a way to divide. And it had an effect on the identity and the way people felt in relation to the colonial ruler, and also felt inside the tribes, inside the groups of themselves. So this is why I'm raising this question. And I think this is something also that works when you think of settler colonialism inside nation states such as France, for example. And the way the division is about reiterating all the time kind of specific identities that otherwise would completely be overlooked. Let me give just an example. In France, when you think of racialization, you think in terms of, you thought across the 20th century and even before, historical anti-Semitism was about the internal other who was the Jew with regard to Christianity. And also the Gypsies, which is something that is often overlooked, but was right there in front of our eyes. And after the decolonization process that really never ended, because decolonization is still ongoing, racialization in France has 2 different modes of expression, which is regarding the blacks from the Caribbean, all these islands, these colonies, these colonized territories, and the Arabs. And one way to divide is to say that among the blacks you have the French blacks, which are the ones from the Caribbean, for example, French Caribbeans, and you have the Africans, who are descendants of indigenous colonized people and enslaved people that France participated in. The slave trade was also French, as we all know. And among the Arabs, it would be to say you do have the Berbers and the Kabyles, for example, in Algeria. And you are not the same. The Kabyles are more civilized than the Arabs, which are savages, sexually violent, and so on and so forth. We know the narrative. So this is why I try to understand how islandization is also some sort of a continental process. It's something that is kind of brought back from the islands to the mainland, so in order to divide and rule. So I think that if we map all of that, we definitely get some sense of where it produces some kinds of identities that are apart, even at odds, although they are part of the same genealogy, which is colonial, racial, and sometimes also social. And this brings the class issue to the conversation. And on the other hand, it does create new identities. And I think I understand what you mean about the Palestinians, the way it has created an identity of resistance. So this is also what decolonizing knowledge would bring to the fore, which how to overcome this attempt, which is very often successful, in dividing identities instead of coalitions of identities that can be useful for resistance. I guess this speaks also to the political economy of identities that translates into the fact that being racialized is precisely the best way to over exploitation in the racial imperialist capitalism. So just
I'm going to ask you if you can just add to this, if you don't mind, the creolization. You spoke about creolization. And then if you talk about creolization, we also know about the whole question of the islands. Let's say, I will speak about the islands that are in the Caribbean. See, talk about Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Haiti, you know, the Martinique. There's a whole bunch of islands that are, and we were at the Caribbean Studies Association conference and so on. So there is the whole question of the islandization. Then you also spoke about the concept of creolization. And I'm thinking, how does that then work about the whole question of self, I mean, how do you think, and I know you're working on it, but if you can just venture some thoughts.
Yeah, maybe briefly. Well, I guess that creolization would be a very strong option to fight against and to challenge islandization. So it is no surprise to you that someone like Vincennes or Patrick Chamoiseau write from the Caribbeans in order to challenge and to not only decipher but to destroy the French white hegemony, not only in the Caribbean but beyond. So that would be interesting to see how the islandization, which is inherent to the French hegemony and to the white French supremacy, is being challenged precisely by creolization. And I think that this is why it's interesting to decenter our gaze and to view all these issues from the islands. There are these small territories that are insignificant and where new significations are being built and are being invented, and in ways they reinvent belonging, and also they reinvent the kind of ties that can overcome the decolonization, the state decolonization, which is colonization ties.
Well, I agree with Nacira that this whole question relates directly to the question Gary raised about race. And I find myself coming back to these really old-fashioned ways of thinking. I never thought this, but you know, old left and Marxist ways of thinking about how racialization divides the working class. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's also true. And when you think about, I think particularly about the strategies and tactics of the Israeli Zionist state to divide up the population of Jews as well as Palestinians into certain strata, the hierarchy of disposability, by doling out little privileges. So, you know, you have Ethiopian Jews, women with AK-47s at the checkpoints. I mean, more, you know, fiercely, you know, defending the Zionist state, even than the Ashkenazis. Trying to what?
It should be an M16, not the AK-47. AK-47.
Oh, I always get the gun. No. You used to say Kalashnikov or something. No, and then you have Druze, who are put in the same position. And I heard a Druze guy, and this gets to creolization, because you have the beginnings of alliances across some of these divisions, especially, for example, in the groups that are refusing military service and walking away from it. Druze working with Mizrahi Jewish soldiers to refuse service. It's small. It's very small, but it's a beginning. So I think racialization is a way of destroying class unity. and giving people a sense that they might have an entryway into the elite. That's so old-fashioned way of thinking, but it's actually true, and reminding me.
Questions that Brooke and Terry speak to each other. And I think that, I think it's really, really important also in our historization and thinking about what happened with 68 and everywhere else. I was actually also going through some of the narratives about France and some of the discussion about how the workers and the students were at odds with each other and so on. And it's so dichotomous, and it's the same, it's reminding me of the ways in which 68, let's say at San Francisco State and elsewhere, is constructed as there is all people of color and there is nobody else. But the people there were teachers who were involved, the people who were engaged in the bailing out the students who were in prison, there was the union was involved in it, the white working class, let's say the working class, not just the white working class. The working class students were being herded into a particular field as opposed to other students who would be seen as having different careers and so on. And this is an old strategy. So I think that's definitely, and I think it's a problem sometimes when we think only race, or we think only class, or we think only gender, and I think this is why the proposal, the invitation to think indivisibility of justice, to think about that you are not actually proposing one thing, but you're coming up with a framework that accounts for different kinds of injustices, and that speaks about that addressing one kind, not without engaging in Olympic oppression, who is more oppressed and who's less oppressed and so on, even though there are, I agree, I believe that there is hierarchies of oppression and people are not the same, and just because people are oppressed by the same system does not mean necessarily that they're going to engage in the strategic alliance that we would like to imagine happening. It doesn't necessarily work that way, and it hasn't worked that way. And I think this speaks to the class, let's say in general, but in terms of like the Palestinian Israeli, and I'll add to what Raz is saying, it's not actually new. I mean, historically, part of the Zionist policies of Judaization of land and labor split the working class in Palestine, because there was a Zionist working class here that was actually trying to dominate all labor and get rid of all Palestinian workers, take over the land, and actually boycott was going on all around. There is actually a very interesting paper that was published in the Journal of Palestine Studies by a young Israeli scholar who talked about what was happening with Jewish Zionist businesses and organizations were boycotting and basically strangling the Palestinian economy. And this is one of the reasons why the 36-39 strike took place. So if we look at it historically, and of course Zach Luckman, Julian Bain, and a whole bunch of people write about that. And that's one of the things that continues to happen in the US. Labor movement, historically, it has scattered the US, as well as the leftist movement that came out or was instigated and active in the labor movement. And it was historically the Histadrut in Israel, which is supposed to represent the workers, continues to take fees from Palestinian workers who have permits from the West Bank, so before in Gaza, not now anymore, to go and work inside Israel, and then uses that as an extortion to extort the Palestinian Authority that is actually created as a result of the Oslo colonial structure. So, and if you think about the political economy aspect of it, and sometimes people only think about what they think is the nationalist aspirations of the Palestinians, or I hate what Rashid was talking about last night about the Arabs. I hate it when people say pro-Palestinian or the Palestinians. It's not pro-Palestinian, it's pro-justice for in Palestine. It's a very different perspective than that. And when you think about that and you think about it, then it's supposed to presuppose that there should be unity, right? But then you come to the racialization question, you come to the nationalist state, not just nation state, the settler colonial project of, let's say here in Israel, that actually works in order to privilege and continue to privilege and continue to co-opt certain parts of the population who racially may be at odds with the state or with the dominant groups of the state, let's say the Ashkenazi Jews. At the same time, they are benefiting from at the expense of the other nationalist group, which is the Palestinians, including, by the way, the Bedouins and the Druze and everybody else, because they do not get the same rewards. Even though if they serve in the military, they still don't get the same rewards as Israeli Jews. The Jews of all colors. Okay, so there is multiple systems of oppression, hierarchy, some of them vertical, some of them horizontal, some of them across, and so on and so forth. I think it's a very interesting matter. I think it's really important for us to teach about that too, because then it defies the oversimplification, but it also brings and shows the power of the Zionist project as a colonial project, but it also shows how people are resisting certain things and may point the pathways towards building some kind of coalition towards a liberation movement. Next round. We'll pose the question to you. But by the way, at 11:30 we have the next panel, and the next panel, let me remind people who are here, the next panel is on comparative perspectives on teaching Palestine and decolonizing the curriculum. It's going to be chaired by Naeem Jina, who is the director of the Afro-Middle East Center in Johannesburg, South Africa. The participants are Rayyan Al-Amin of the American University of Beirut, the Jaime Veve, Transport Workers Union retired, and on Puerto Rico and Palestine, and Ahmed Azam from Birzeit University. They're all going to be talking about the comparative perspectives on teaching Palestine. After lunch, we have a panel on censoring Palestine, Islamophobia, Neo-McCarthyism, and campus politics, chaired by Salim Shahade from University of California, Los Angeles. Participants are Saad Abu Hijle and Najah National University in Palestine, Brooke Lorber, Professor of Gender and Women and Gender Studies at Sonoma State, and Enrico Don, Amani Azzuddin, and Minna Al-Gamal from University of Washington. Each of them, everybody is going to be discussing this, and from 5 to 7 we're going to have the plenary where we will discuss future prospects. So please stick with us. If there are no questions, I will throw the question back at you, or maybe ask my colleagues if you have any wrapping points. Okay, so I will ask you if you want to have some.
No, just one thing that I wanted to add to the conversation about tracking students in certain ways. As you may know, it's also something that is happening in the widespread Western, so-called Western area, and that has to do with depriving the majority, the white majority, from one of its privileges, which was to have free access to education. I'm talking about Western Europe. And now higher education has become a privilege and has become something through which students are being tracked from high school to higher education in such ways that they may feel that they are being deprived of one of their fundamental rights. I think this is an extension of what is happening for what we call, very interestingly, minoritized groups, which is extended to the wider community. So it's an interesting movement in which what used to be considered as a general right and a fundamental right, which is the right to education, has become conditional.
Well, I would just add it's become in the United States a form of indenture. The politics of debt, the political economy of debt, has made student loans the biggest, next to credit cards, the biggest source of revenue for banks. So students are signing over their bodies and souls to indebtedness for their lives, and that might not be an attractive prospect for some. So better not to go to university.
I'm going to actually, I remember that. One is there is a very old thesis by a member of the Birmingham School of Critical Cultural Studies, Paul Lewis. Very, very old. The book is called Learning to Labor. And he actually goes through how is it that the working class Britain, I think it was Manchester, but I'm not sure, I don't remember anymore. He talks about how is it that there is identity that is being formed, part working class, part gender, part white, that gets formed as a result of actually not going to school. And I don't think he goes, I will take it just one step further, saying that it's also a way to kind of like create this distinction, or maybe deal with the possibilities of being excluded from the system by excluding yourself first out. The second aspect of it, the political economy of education in particular, is the corporatization and the privatization of the universities, including public universities, by reliance on donors who are actually setting the agenda. Whether we are talking about the pro-Israel lobby, in the case of San Francisco State University and other places, or we're talking about the right-wing agenda of the Koch brothers, or sometimes they coincide with each other. University of Arizona is one place, and elsewhere, where actually the agenda becomes to create glitzy, shiny spaces that look really good for marketing, to put names on buildings at the end, but at the end of the day is actually shrinking the public space that's available for discussion, for critical discourse, for teaching also, including teaching Palestine, and other things as well. So I think this is very much involved, and they all go hand in hand with each other. The denial of tuition, cutting down, raising the fees, putting the fees for specific things, giving contracts for food at the university for multinationals, and denying them for people who are like the little mom and pop, which is happening at San Francisco State, little mom and pop stores that come from the community and so on. It's making it so much impossible. And then the fact that you also cut down on remedial classes, what happens is that now the students who are able to catch up are the students who come well prepared from schools that happen to have more funding, that happen to be charter schools, especially with the United States. We know that now with the whole, but I'm assuming that it's happening everywhere. So this is